Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming out on a cold, almost winter night. My name is Bill Cavanaugh. I'm the director of the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology here at DePaul. You're very welcome. We try to do hospitality as best we can. There's lots of food there, so please don't be shy and feel free to get up during the presentation and refill your plates. So we want everybody to be happy. And I'm especially happy to have Father Paul Kollman here with us tonight. Good friend and a really rare combination of brains and virtues in such a way that it really makes you wonder why God is so unfair. So Paul is an associate professor of theology at Notre Dame and also the executive director of the Center for Social Concerns, which is really a remarkable outfit at Notre Dame that is in charge of so many wonderful efforts to get the students out into the world and attending to issues of social justice. And I know from my own undergraduate days there, it has a profound impact on a lot of people's lives. Paul has a PhD from the University of Chicago, and he's an Africanist. His books include The Evangelization of Slaves and Catholic Origins in Eastern Africa. And here he's doing research on missionary movements in East Africa, where he spent quite a bit of time. He's a Holy Cross priest, and Holy Cross has an important presence there. So please join me in what I should mention as well that Paul and I are classmates from Notre Dame, the class of 1984. Which I really can't quite understand because I'm 29 and Paul is 54. So how that worked out. But please join me in welcoming Paul Kollman.
Well, thank you very much for being here, and I ought to begin by thanking also the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology, where I'm spending the semester on research leave from Notre Dame. Embedded in the Catholic Studies Department, the Center's been a very supportive and congenial setting for my work, and I appreciate its director, Bill Cavanaugh, other faculty members, Michael Buddy and Father Stan Chuilo, as well as Karen Kraft and Francis Salanel, and student assistant Anna Galon. So thank you very much. Anna ordered the food, so you can thank her for that. I should also thank Professor Clement Adibe, who will offer a brief response to my talk. Professor Adibe teaches here in the Political Science Department. I'm grateful to him for filling that role. My interest in Africa arose because I studied in Kenya as a seminarian in the late 80s. And I studied at the seminary where this chapel is housed. This is the backdrop behind the altar of the chapel at Hekima College in Nairobi, Kenya. I watched that painting be made. It was 1987, and the artist Angelbert Vang, a Jesuit from Cameroon, later murdered in rather suspicious circumstances, designed that and then spoke, and I heard him speak. My time in Kenya led me to want to understand the African Catholic Church more fully, and so I've taught in Africa a couple of times since, been back for numerous research gigs. I teach students from Africa at this point in my life and guide their dissertations. I would say it's important for me to say this personally. Africa and its church, its Christianity and its Catholicism in particular, have become more than simply objects of academic interest for me. Like many people here, I care about the church. But things about the church annoy me, too. And by trying to understand the church here and understand the church in Africa, I feel like I'm able to practice what I call comparative anger or frustration management. By that I mean, what frustrates and angers me about the church here in the United States when I think about the church in Africa gets a little bit relieved. But when I'm in Africa, I get frustrated by things in the church there, and when I come back here, I get a little bit relieved. So comparative perspectives do offer us a grounding, I find, in the capacity to bear hope moving into the future. And a center like the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology helps make that hope available to more and more people by giving people a comparative perspective on what God is doing in the world. My talk's going to have three parts, pretty straightforward. First, I'll talk about the recent growth of the Christianity and the Catholic Church on the continent, and as well kind of offer what is the standard historical framework for that growth. A picture that scholars trot out pretty regularly. Second, I will consider that three plantings idea and talk about recent research that kind of calls into question that framework with some of its assumptions. And finally, I want to talk about the global church in Africa. I'm going to move over here because I don't need these texts so much. Now, it may be controversial for some of you that I would single out the Catholic Church in Africa, but I do think as the largest single Christian body in the world and the largest Christian body in Africa, we gain certain insights into the Catholic Church globally and certain insights into African Christianity by focusing on the African Catholic Church. So I will do some of that. But some people think you sort of treat all Christians together in a place like Africa because denominational differences matter less. I don't find that compelling. I find denominational differences worth paying attention to, even if we're not confined by them. So, where Christians are in the world, and this is 7 years ago, and the Americas are treated together, as you can see. What's true about this is that these numbers are only going to expand toward the south. Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and the number of Christians in North America and Europe is going to shrink. And if you actually counted the people who were in church on a given Sunday, it would even be more heavily weighted south. Because certainly church attendance in places like Western Europe is very scant. Africa, 60-some countries, complex place. How big is Africa? I love this slide. All of Europe, all of the United States, all of China, plus can fit into Africa. So, amid the diversity of peoples and nations, languages and cultures, religions and ways of life, it's very hard to generalize about Africa. Because everything you say can be contradicted by another example from elsewhere on the continent. But we're going to draw some general lessons from what we can make sense of in a contemporary perspective. So Christianity in Africa. In 1900, 80% of the world's Christians were in Europe or North America. Now 60% live in the global east or the global south. One way to talk about Latin America, Africa, and Asia. And that number is going to grow. There are 2 billion Christians on earth, about 1/3 of the world's population. In 1900, there were 9 million Christians in Africa, almost all in 2 countries, Egypt or Ethiopia. Today, there are 45 million, 1945, 30 million, 1970, 150 million. Today, 500 million plus Christians. Probably a little bit over half the continent's population is Christian. It might be the single largest accession toward a new religious identity in world history, what has happened in Africa over the last 75 or 80 years. There's nothing like it in terms of world, past religious changes we might think about. So facts, there are 600,000 different congregations, 13,500 denominations throughout Africa. Most are completely unknown in the West. Countries like Nigeria, Ghana, Congo, South Africa, Kenya, multiply churches. Lots of small storefront churches. Lots of places that have a charismatic leader that rise up very quickly. Of the 500 million Christians, close to 200 million are what are called renewalists. That is people who believe in the gifts of the Holy Spirit. Pentecostals and charismatics. So over 1/3. Many of them are Catholic charismatics. So close to 200 million of Africa's Christians are Catholics. Now, quiz. What are the top Catholic countries in Africa? Professor Adibe and Father Chuilo cannot speak. But other Africans can. So what is the top country in Africa in terms of number of Catholics? Yeah.
I would guess maybe Ethiopia.
Ethiopia, no.
The Cameroon?
Cameroon, no.
Congo?
Congo is number 1, 28 million. Yeah, Democratic Republic of the Congo, right? The DRC, the large country in the middle. Yeah.
Uganda?
Uganda's down a ways. Second would be Nigeria, 24 million. Primarily, but not entirely in the southeast, but probably, of that number, probably 18 million or so are in the southeast of the country. Third?
Kenya?
It's Uganda, then Tanzania, then Kenya. And these countries gained their Catholic population compared to other kinds of Christians because of missionary patterns, because of the ways local populations took on the faith. And some of this number is due to immense population growth. These countries differ in the kind of rate of population growth they have as well to this day, due to things like how much birth control is available, economic growth, etc. These change people's birth rates and growth rates, change the way religious demographics exist in countries like this. So I love this slide too. So this dot represents the center of the world Christian population at that time. 30 AD, Jerusalem, that's where all the Christians were, was really much in Jerusalem. Over the next couple hundred years, it moved east, or moved west. Then it moved back east because there were many Christians in this part of the world. The Persian Empire was primarily Christian before Islam came. Then it started to move north because Europe became Christianized. Then it started 1500. Columbus encountered the New World, 1492. Christianity started to move even more quickly east and south. Between 1900 and 2000, that arrow has gone straight south due to the growth of Christianity in Africa primarily. Also Latin America as its population has grown. And it's going to be just going more and more southeast into the future. So, as I say, there's a standard story of how Christianity came to be. This story of 3 different plantings. First of all, Christianity in northern Africa, the 1st through 8th centuries. Northern Africa, as I'll talk about, was a Christian heartland at that time. One of the centers of the world Christian movement. There were people we could say were like proto-Catholics, proto-Orthodox, all sorts of other kinds of Christian groups in North Africa, from Egypt to Ethiopia, all the way across to Morocco. Then, starting in about 1500, Portuguese explored around Africa, coming from Portugal, the edge of Europe, around the Cape of Good Hope, and established small missions and mission stations on the coast of Africa. And then the Christianity that has grown in sub-Saharan Africa is usually attributed to this 3rd planting. 19th and 20th century missionary activity by Catholics and Protestants, mostly from Europe. Now, the standard story is like failure, failure, success. For sort of obvious reasons. This is ancient North Africa. This is a funny slide because this should be over here, right? See Libya, Libya. And so you see that's across North Africa there from Mauritania over to Egypt. But, of course, we know that the spread of Islam in the 7th to the 13th century sort of, according to the standard story, squashed that Christianity and its forms, or at least drove it deeply underground. And there's profound truth in this, but I want to contest it. Then this is kind of the Portuguese story, these explorers that founded kind of little places where missionaries worked very slightly into the interior of Africa, starting in the late 15th century, into the 18th century. This is also seen to be sort of a failure because the Portuguese were usually driven out. It was a small population, a small country. They didn't have a lot of missionaries to send. So failure, failure. And then kind of the stage 3, the 19th and 20th century missions. These are kind of arrows of Catholic and Protestant missionary bodies that have acted and started acting in Africa starting in the early 19th century. It's not a comprehensive or complete list. Those are some of the earliest groups. So mostly by Europeans, some Canadians and US citizens, Protestants and Catholics before, during, and after colonial overrule. And colonialism was an important part of this. most of African Christianity and the countries where it started to grow, only the growth really started to occur once colonialism was in place. British, French, Portuguese, German, Belgian, mostly, some Italian colonialism. Not all. Uganda would be an exception, for instance. Uganda's Christians really grew a little bit before colonialism in a pretty interesting sort of way. So, I want to say, okay, there's the three plantings. North Africa, Portuguese Africa, modern missionary movement. But there are reasons to ask hard questions about this. First of all, Christianity in Northern Africa didn't really disappear. Ethiopia remained profoundly Christian. Egypt remained pretty significantly Christian. To this day, probably 10 to 15% of Egypt's population is Christian, the Copts. And it's a strong community, not a simple community. Complex for other Christians to interact with. But there's a lot of Christians in Egypt. And there remain some. Second, ancient African Christianity continued contributing to the life of Christians everywhere else because of things Christians in Africa did in those first 6 or 7 centuries. I'll talk a little bit about that. Third, there was some profound Christian activity based on what the Portuguese were able to do, especially in a place called the Kingdom of the Congo that I'll talk about in a minute. And fourth, I think it's worth saying that the fourth planting of Christianity has happened. And it's not Christianity into Africa, it's African Christianity going elsewhere. Now, all over the rest of the world, there are African-founded churches that have presences in cities like Chicago, and many smaller cities as well, where there be a sizable number of African immigrants, but they don't just attract African immigrants to their worship. They draw in all sorts of people. The largest gathering congregation on any given Sunday in Europe is in Kiev, Ukraine. It's a Nigerian church. So, ancient Africa. Nubia was just south of Egypt, and Nubia was a Christian kingdom until the 14th century. This mosaic was just uncovered about 4 or 5 years ago in Faras. It had been buried by history and the sands. We have a deeper appreciation all the time of how Nubia was a dynamic Christian place. Until 1300 and something, when they were finally defeated by Muslims. So there's a really strong situation of Christian presence and vitality in Nubia. Again, Ethiopia was Christian and continued to be Christian, and still to this day, many Ethiopians think of themselves as a Christian nation, even when most of their population might not be Christian. I think it's probably 60-40 Muslim Christian in general. But the national story is a Christian story, interestingly. So there is a recently deceased Methodist American theologian named Tom Oden, who died just last year. He wants to say, you know, African Christianity is like this gem. And in an effort to give African Christians a past that they can be proud of, he says you don't have to make anything up. All you have to do is kind of pay attention to what they achieved in those first 6 or 7 centuries. So he established the Center for Early African Christianity. He sees 7 achievements of African Christianity with abiding significance for Christians everywhere. I'm not going to make this a point of my talk, but he has a great website to talk about these. He's got books about it. So the first university that was Christian in Alexandria. The way we interpret the Bible, called Bible exegesis, Africans taught Greeks how to do that. The Cappadocians read Africans. The first definitions of dogma by Athanasius, he was an African. Ecumenical council practices first happened in Africa. In addition, monasticism arose in Africa. Christian Neoplatonism, philosophy, first was done in Africa. And how Christians learned how to speak and argue, rhetoric and dialectic. African Christian achievements. So Oden has done a wonderful job kind of giving African Christians a usable past without having to make anything up, just like remembering well where these people who did these things actually were. Well, turn now again, like 600 years later, when Christianity was in the Congo. It's hard for us to imagine, but the king of the Congo, here it's straddled what is now Congo and Angola, really. And they usually try to distinguish it from the contemporary country of the Congo by using the K, right? Just to talk about the people who founded that kingdom. That kingdom had ties with the Pope, like the King of France, the King of Portugal, and the King of Spain. Sent ambassadors. The first king's son, went to Rome and was trained as a priest, and then became a bishop, and was sent back in 1520 or something like that. So this is a very vital kingdom for about 2 centuries. Eventually it was killed actually by the slave trade, going to the Atlantic, across the Atlantic to the New World, mostly to Brazil, but also even some to South Carolina, we're pretty sure. Finally, I said, another way to think about it is that there's a fourth planting, African independent churches that have gone global. Just some slides of some African Christian activity that has a global presence. This is a female preacher in a Kenyan church. There's branches of that church all over the world. This is a South African church that is present all over the world. These are some West African preachers who have churches all over the world. So, as I said, the 3 plantings framework, it's okay, but there are reasons to contest it, if that makes sense. Now, you can also contest it from particularly a Catholic perspective. And that's in some ways what I want to conclude a bit with, because it's in some ways the most important thing I want to say. When you think about this as a Catholic, you do a little bit things differently. You emphasize Rome and North Africa less than Egypt and Ethiopia. The reason being, well, I'll explain. Rome and North Africa, in some ways, is an antecedent to Catholicism differently than Egypt and Ethiopia. In some ways, Egypt was a Greek-speaking place. Rome and North Africa was a Latin-speaking place, already in the first and second and third centuries. Ethiopia was sort of outside of the Orthodox Catholic divide. It's its own sort of thing. One of the ecumenical councils called Chalcedon, the Ethiopians never accepted. So it really gave their Christianity almost a Jewish feel that few other Christian bodies have. Second, I think it's worth noting the achievements of Congolese Catholicism. And we'll talk some about that. The other things I want to say is that it's worth saying, I'm going to not talk a lot about these, but Catholic missionary achievements were really important in that 19th and 20th century. Some of you who go to Catholic Church will recognize something called the RCIA, which is the Rite of Christian Initiation of Adults that happens in Catholic parishes in this country. People become Catholic by going through the RCIA. It's pretty clear that that was revived in the church due to the effort of White Father, called Missionary of Africa, missionaries in Eastern Africa, who worked hard to bring Ugandans and Tanzanians into the church and revived the ancient Christian practice of the catechumenate, which had fallen into disuse in the church. But starting in the late 19th and 20th centuries, they revived it. Finally, if you think about the kind of fourth planting, we all know African Catholic religious and clergy are a global presence. Stan, how many do you think are here in Chicago?
40.
40?
Mm-hmm.
40 African Catholic priests. And there's plus religious sisters and maybe brothers as well. Yep. Seminarian here. So the global planting of African Christianity elsewhere has happened in the Catholic Church as well. Not new churches, but new church personnel who go all over the world in service. So let's talk a little about Roman North Africa. As I said, Roman North Africa spoke Latin in its educated language. It's the first Christian writing in Latin, is the account of the Silitan martyrs in 180 AD CE. And the first time the Bible is written in Latin and translated in Latin happens in North Africa as well. Second, it's worth noting that the theology of Roman North Africa, shaped by important people like Tertullian, Cyprian, Augustine, is practical more than speculative compared to some of the Greek-speaking theology that was going on at the same time. That is, they were really interested in seeing how you could become a friend of Jesus's and how Jesus could help you. They didn't spend a whole lot of time thinking about how the incarnation happened or how the persons of the Trinity were related to one another. That was more of a speculative Greek practice. Now, it did happen. Augustine wrote an amazing treatise on the Trinity. But if you looked at the balance across North Africa, Roman North Africa, not Egypt, not Ethiopia, this part, practical theology. Finally, apologetics, that is, arguments about Christianity's value and truth instead of philosophical explication, tends to be how Roman North African theologians wrote and argued. Now, this is another thing that really shaped Roman North Africa profoundly: persecution. We know that up to 312 AD, the church was illegal. Christianity was illegal in the Roman Empire, and there were periodic martyrdoms. Well, martyrdoms create apostasy, denying the faith publicly. What do you do with someone who denies the faith? How do you bring them back into the church? Do you bring them back into the church? Are they forever gone? What if they're a priest? What if they're a bishop? There were people tortured who renounced their faith under the pressure of the government's activity. What did you do with them? Well, this is a real live question for North African Catholics, Christians at the time, 1st, 2nd, 3rd century. So there are different answers. For instance, in the 2nd century, Tertullian says they're gone. Once they've renounced the faith, we don't welcome them back. Cyprian talked about, yeah, they do lose the Holy Spirit, but after a series of processes, they can be brought back. The Donatists said they had to be rebaptized. That was seen to be a heresy later. And Augustine kind of resolves it by talking about sacraments having a mark on your soul that can't be taken away, and also saying, even if a priest is a jerk and a heretic and denounced the faith, his sacraments are still valid. So I got that going for me. So this experience of persecution, which was rigorous, led to a deep reverence for martyrs, especially in Roman North Africa. It's the first place there are martyrdom accounts, the Scylladan martyrs and Perpetua and Felicity in the early 3rd century. 2 females. She was a slave of this one. They both were killed, eaten by animals in an arena. And when they talked about these kinds of what to do about people who had committed apostasy, North African Christians were concerned about the church's holiness. How does the church stay holy? What keeps the church holy? They didn't worry as much about the respectability or even sacramental validity. They wanted the church's ministers and the church publicly to be holy. I'm kind of planting this because I want to kind of show how I think there are continuities to the present from this way of thinking about the faith. So Congolese Catholicism, kind of just to go, again, 1,000 years later, right? It wasn't just great 16th, 17th century diplomatic ties with Europe and the Vatican. The more we know about the Catholic Congo, the more the achievement of a Catholic culture and people we know occurred. It was deep. They had a deep sacramental life. When missionaries had to withdraw from there for 25 years, one priest went back and baptized 300,000 people in 6 months. People were so hungry to be drawn back into the faith. So we know that there was a profound culture that was deeply Catholic. There was a sacramental worldview, and there's a recent book of Congolese Christian art that's been recovered. The art that's been recovered, there's been a book written about it, showing how it brings together Congolese cultural values and the Christian faith. And so, it makes you even sadder. Another tragedy of the slave trade is that it helped destroy African Catholicism in the 17th and 18th century. We're pretty sure that the first big slave rebellion in these United States in 1730 in South Carolina was among and led by Catholic Congolese slaves in South Carolina, the Stono Rebellion. The cheers and the kind of language they were using was Congolese, and we know from the history of the Congolese church 30 years before then that that was the kind of piety that was going on in the Congolese church when these guys would have been taken as slaves and brought to the New World. So just another kind of way to think about the connections. Now there's this old Latin expression, ex Africa semper aliquid novi. There's always something new out of Africa. And that could not be more true than it is about Christianity and Catholicism today. There's always something new out of Africa. So I want to talk a little bit, in conclusion, just to talk about the Catholic past of Africa in light of the present and the future. We're seeing a change in representative Catholicism. If you've got to say, who's the average Catholic in the world now, soon it's going to be an African woman. It's not going to be an Italian person or a French person. It might remain a Latin American person if you kind of get there, but it's going to be an African woman. And African Catholicism is more Pentecostalized. If you go to worship in many places in Africa, it feels much more like a charismatic or Pentecostal service in this country. I don't think that's going to stop either. They continue to face practical issues. This is a friend of mine, an anthropologist named China Schurz. She teaches at Reed College, and then she's out in Virginia, had been at Reed College. She wrote a beautiful book comparing Ugandan sisters with fancy international development agencies in Uganda in their efforts to help local people in eastern Uganda. And her book is a remarkable slam dunk for the value of what the sisters do. And a pretty strong condemnation or questioning of the kind of global gospel of development in its efforts to assist and accompany African people as they make advances in their lives. And she just shows the African Catholic Church has an instinctive capacity to help people where they need to be helped, when they're being helped right. And this, I know the sisters she kind of studied, and I think it's probably right. It's a local community. In theology, there are these two terms that are sometimes used to talk about how culture and faith relate. Syncretism is a negatively charged word. It's like a 10-letter, 4-letter word. All right? So it's like, it means wrong mixing. Like syncretism is a negative term. Enculturation is usually the positive word to describe what people who don't like it call syncretism. Right? Congolese Catholicism is a great historical example of how this actually happened. How an African people became formally Catholic. And there's a lot they can teach us and other African Catholics today. Finally, I want to say something about the abiding challenges that face Africa in the contemporary world. And these days, people who work in the African church know that it is common that when people experience misfortune, their instincts lead them to find out who did this to me through some accusation of witchcraft or juju, or in different languages there's words for this kind of malevolence that is spiritual and hidden, that causes things to go bad for people. And there's a kind of standard way to interpret that as like the pervasive, abiding primitiveness of Africa. My own sense is that's just not very helpful or accurate. All sorts of people who are professionals have this instinct inside of them, and collective malevolence can cause all sorts of problems in all sorts of subtle ways too, that we still are learning about, I think. But my own sense as well is when you put this kind of into an historical perspective, you see in this concern about witchcraft an abiding sense that the church and the world we live in would be holy and intact. My sense is there's a lot we can learn about these witchcraft accusations by thinking them in theological continuity with early Christians and how they cared about the holiness of the church as well. That's something my own research doesn't go into very much, but I just think it's there. So Africa's gifts for the Catholic global future. I think African Catholics, African Christians and Catholics in particular, continue to have a deep attachment to the human Christ as accessible and intimate, and the power of the Holy Spirit. It's alive there, and when you're there, you feel it. And the appeal of charismatic Catholicism for African Catholics is real. And you sort of, again, you see this desire for holiness that allows us to reframe witchcraft accusations, not as some remnant of a primitive worldview, but as a response to contemporary experiences and desires for a holy church. Second, I think Africa has a lot to teach us and give us with examples of virtue, especially around social and political reconciliation. One of my predecessors in the current role I have as visiting scholar at the Center for World Catholicism is Father Emmanuel Kollman, who teaches with me at Notre Dame. And he writes about stories of reconciliation, lifting up these heroic figures who've suffered a great deal in Africa and have drawn on the resources of their faith to work for something better. Father Kollman's work I commend to you. Finally, there's something called the Dictionary of African Christian Biography. I want to go to it because it is an existing resource for students and others who want to know how African Christians have lived. This is an open source website which anyone can contribute to by writing biographies. I know professors in Africa and elsewhere who assign as one of the tasks of their course that each student write a biography to be submitted to the DACB. If you go down to stories and you go all stories, it'll start A through F. And so those are the A's. And they do it by affiliation, that is Catholic, etc., country, and the language in which the article is written. There are thousands of these entries. This is the first, Africa is the only place I know of where this kind of resource exists. I think it's a sign of the recognition that the stories of virtuous people are valuable for Africans. And I talked about the reverence for martyrs in the early African church. In some ways, I see that existing now also. I want to talk about one more. There are martyrs today in Africa who ought to draw our attention. I talked about the Sillerton martyrs and Perpetua and Felicity in the early church. In the beginning of the missionary period, the martyrs of Uganda drew the attention of not just Ugandan Christians, but Christians all over Africa. To this day, the June 3rd feast in Uganda is a national holiday attracting over 1 million people to an outdoor mass celebration. They come from all over the continent, but especially Uganda. Perhaps you know this story in 1996 of Trappist monks in Algeria who were killed. Their story was made in a movie, a French-speaking movie called Of Gods and Men. Beautiful film. My sense is the African church has gifts to give us in the martyrs who suffer for the faith there to this day. We know there are places where interreligious conflicts create martyrs. We also know that people's faith puts them in all sorts of places where they can teach us by their resilience and their courage. So thank you. It's been good to talk to you, and now I welcome Clement. Yeah.
So Clement, if you'd like to come up, I just want to introduce Professor Clement Adibe, from originally from Nigeria, PhD from Queen's University, and specialist in international relations, conflict and peace studies, and he's just going to give a brief response to Father Paul's talk. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And I would like to thank Professor Kollman for what a wonderful lecture. you did something really incredible. You made a black African blush. And it's my understanding that Professor Kollman's family is here. Welcome to DePaul. And thank you very much for sharing him with us. We really appreciate that. I'm a political scientist, and I'm an African. And I'm here to respond to a lecture by a theologian. That's quite a challenge. It's not very often that political scientists and experts in religion agree, even though my colleague is one of the founders of this institute, my buddy. And I know my brother here and my sisters here know that and have had a great relationship with him. But you have him. One of the first things you have to note about us political scientists is that we love conflict. Conflict of ideas, even physical conflict. And I think that what Professor Kollman did here is to bring both together. Conflict of ideas and talk about physical conflict. So African martyrs. I was struck by his emphasis on the Congo, because that is a part of the world that is not very well known. Congo has been and remains a disaster. And it is in the heart of Africa. And what is very compelling about it, as Professor Kollman tells us, is that this is also one of the places where Christianity took roots in Africa. And the interaction with European missionaries there did not help them. They were enslaved. They were brutally enslaved. And their resources became a burden to them. 200 years later, it's still a problem, despite their Christianity. And that story of the Congo is writ large in Africa, in West Africa, in North Africa. The fact of your faith did not spare you the other faith, F-A-T-E. And that faith was often brutal, was often deadly. I cannot help but look at our world today and where we are. Rise of nationalism, even in this country, that was for a very long time the beacon of the world. We see restlessness, we see increasingly a lack of compassion, we see an inclination towards authoritarianism. Maybe it is global, but it's not new. What is new is that today we have the mass media on our fingertips, and we get to know about them. I think that what Professor Kollman did today is to highlight what we know today as fake news and real news. Who tells the story? Africans never told their story. African Christians did their work the way Christ did it, with simplicity, with absolutely no regard for commendation. They were often very poor. They struggled even to maintain their own families, the way Christ did. He left his family, he was with strangers, and he was very comfortable. What changed was the European version of Christianity. With all due respect, that was a cultural intervention as much as it was a religious intervention. What do I mean by that? When Christianity left its African roots and went to Europe, mind you, it met an authoritarian political structure. And suddenly, command and control became part of Christianity. Different popes became relevant not only as religious figures, but also as political figures. So the idea of a command structure came down to Africa and wreaked havoc on traditional institutions as well as an existing religion. And so, for the African, Christianity, whether it is Catholicism or Protestantism, went alongside dictatorship and oppression. Hence, the contradiction that here I am, a political scientist, and an African, and a Christian. So, I want to thank Professor Kollman again for highlighting that. But amongst the many lessons that I think African Christianity teaches, not only Catholicism, but Christianity, and I will add humanity, is the idea of forgiveness. Africans have struggled with this for a very long time. African Christians were, after all, removed from their own societies. One of my favorite authors, Chinua Achebe, wrote a book that you probably know about. If you don't know about it, I will urge you to pick it up. Things Fall Apart. That was an undergraduate thesis, by the way, so for all the undergrads here, your thesis can actually be a book. And it was the story of an African society that was otherwise whole and then became Christianized. And the bonds of family, of friendship, of ethos, all of that were shattered. African Christians, early African Christians were ostracized from their own family, they were ostracized from their own society, and they were not even welcomed by those who converted them. And that was the real tragedy. And as Achebe tells us in that work, things really did fall apart. And yet, they found it in themselves to forgive those who offended them, those who ostracized them, those who converted them, only to let them down. And that is a powerful story. That's a powerful message. Many Africans like me today, in the 21st century, wonder what happened to that forgiveness. Why are we so quick to forgive others and not ourselves? In many African societies, such as Professor Kollman has visited, the conflict between Christians and non-Christians is real and it is dirty. The conflict between different sects of Christianity is real and it is dirty. And yet, we forgave the Europeans who imposed Christianity on us. So, let's revisit that, the idea of forgiveness, that it should be total. The other thing that I think African Christianity teaches us, that I would like to highlight myself in this day and age of pomposity, is sheer simplicity. I find it very difficult to see Christians being pompous, because the whole idea of Christianity is simplicity. The sharing of what you have with those around you, not looking down on people because of your privilege. And yet, early African Christianity was full of pomposity. Churches were bigger than society. You know those spears in European churches, right? Traditional European cities, tallest buildings were churches. And they were made to impress. That was transplanted into Africa. Many churches were bigger than communities, but they were only meant for the few. And so you began to see the creation of a new class. Not just social class, but also economic class. That has persisted. Maybe we need to return to those roots of simplicity again, to re-Africanize the church and bring it back to its roots of humility. Third and finally, I don't want to take much of your time because I want you to engage in this Q&A, is exactly this. Where are the women? I find it very difficult that Christianity, in its modern sense, especially in Catholicism, and I'm Protestant. I'm sorry.
We forgive you.
Yes, has strenuously excluded women. Because Christianity could not have existed without women. Think about Mary Magdalene, the first and the only person who saw the risen Christ. If she hadn't told that story, we would not have known about the risen Christ. And without the risen Christ, there wouldn't have been Christianity. And yet, women are excluded. If Africa didn't have enough divisions, this was one more layer of division. Early African Christians excluded women. They continue to do so, especially in Catholic churches. Women cannot be priests, but they can contribute money. They can do the dishes. They clean the church, unlike here, where we hire people who clean the church and pay them. In Africa, women clean the church, unpaid. We should confront that. The church in its present state, in my view, has to get back to that humility, and that will enable us to take care of one more issue, which I think is very important. As Professor Kollman mentioned, the future of the church is a woman, and it's an African woman. Let's bring that woman back into the church where she belongs. So I want to thank you again, Professor Kollman, for a very wonderful lecture, and I want to thank all of you for coming and listening to all of us, and have a great evening. Thank you very much.
If you have a question, I'll put the microphone up here. If you would please come up and use the microphone, because we're recording this. It'll be...
I have to ask one, right? Paul, a couple of quick questions. A quick one and then a more extensive one. The church goes back and forth with the Pope, some conservative, some liberal. African candidates for Pope. I love Pope Francis, but who's on the list there? Secondly, I think it was the Anglicans when they had a big, world conference. There was a lot of tension between the more progressive cardinals and bishops in England and the much more conservative members in Africa. Do you see that as an issue going forward if we do get an African Pope, or even if we don't?
In terms of like Papabile African cardinals and bishops, I think there'd be many. When you start naming names, it gets complex. Some of the most prominent now are probably becoming aged out. So it's hard to know who the people who'd now be in their 50s are. Those are people whose names I really don't know. I would know the ones like Cardinal Sarah, Cardinal Turkson, who will be older, Cardinal Onaikan of Nigeria. There are some remarkable leaders of the church in Africa who would be people potentially able to be elected to Pope, I think. But that's just me. You bring up the case that in some ways Africa has been a place where the Anglican Communion has discovered a source of disunity pretty profoundly over the last 20 years, especially issues around women in the church and around welcome accorded to gay and lesbian people. The Anglican Communion is a worldwide network of churches that follow the rule of the Church of England, right? But they really do have national sovereignty very often when there's a big enough national presence. So the Anglican Church of Nigeria, the Anglican Church of Kenya and Uganda are very strong Anglican churches. And in fact, certainly on a given Sunday, there'd be more Anglicans in church in each of those three countries than probably the rest of the world combined. So if it's the weight of the Anglican community is even more toward Africa than the Catholic Church. As you say, on those social issues that are dear to Episcopalians in our country, or what we call Anglicans in the United States, or Episcopalians, the social issues around welcoming women, welcoming gay and lesbian people into full life of the church, that are important to American Episcopalians and Anglicans in the United Kingdom are not very important to Africans. Indeed, African Anglicans can sometimes see them as betrayals of the gospel. So that is what has fractured that communion in some ways. And for instance, conservative Episcopalian congregations in this country, if they're conservative, sometimes affiliate with African Anglican dioceses in Nigeria, Uganda, and Tanzania, or Kenya, because they want their bishop to be a more conservative person. As you might recognize, that causes problems for Episcopalians in this country. Thanks for bringing that up. You know, the Catholic Church hasn't suffered those kinds of disunities the same way, but we have had lots of divisions over these kinds of issues.
I'm full of questions. I have 3. Feel free to just pick one or answer all 3. The first one is, I stepped out and I came back and I saw that you mentioned something about witchcraft, and I was wondering, how do you reconcile, you know, the witchcraft process, whatever, practice with Christianity? And also the second question is about reconciliation. Women leaders in the church, African leaders, how do you reconcile the scripture that says that women shouldn't have authority over men and be in positions of leadership? And then how do we reconcile that with trying to bring the African woman or women in general into leadership roles in the church? And then the last question is, you mentioned, I think you said Uganda, how Christianity evolved pre-colonial times, and I just wanted to know if you could expand on that just a little bit.
In terms of witchcraft, if you talk about witchcraft as like felt malevolence trying to harm other people, no one ever admits that they're guilty of that. Everybody says they're just doing preventive witchcraft against someone else who's trying to do that to them. So they accuse people of witchcraft. That's the bigger problem, are the accusations of witchcraft. So, now, that said, my guess is there may be people who use nefarious means to undermine the well-being of others, but no one admits that. So when you talk about the practice of witchcraft, what I most meant was the accusations of witchcraft, which I wanted to connect to a zeal for holiness in the church that's abiding, I think, in African history, and African Christian history. In terms of the value of women leaders who can practice and achieve reconciliation, I think that goes without saying. There are all sorts of examples. Even Congolese Christianity in the 17th and 18th century raises up this very interesting woman who was possessed by St. Anthony, she thought. And she was like a prophetess who was eventually burned at the stake by the Inquisition in the Congo in 1704, I think. And lots of African Christian groups have been sites for the raising up of women's leadership. Even in the Catholic Church, women have been prominent, mostly religious sisters, from the beginning, and in some ways it was a way for certain African women to achieve prominence, and still is, especially in healthcare and education, but also just in formal Catholic life. But I understand the sense of being sidelined and being not only the male-only priesthood. That is a clear kind of a boundary. So I think having women in leadership is important. I don't think the scriptural record taken as a whole, there are certain lines that seem to inhibit women being able to speak publicly in church, etc. But there are other ways you can use the scriptures to defend women's full participation, for instance, the ministry of Jesus himself. So I think it's dangerous to proof text contemporary practices based on verses from the Bible that we think are more important than others. I think we have to kind of read the scriptures as a whole, and we find a much more capacious welcome of women fully into the life of the Christian community if you do that. Finally, Uganda was pretty remarkable in being the only place that I know of in sub-Saharan Africa where there was a massive move to Christianity before formal colonial overrule. And the Uganda martyrs are a big part of the reason. Those women and men who died for their faith inspired Catholics and Anglicans, Ugandans, to join both the Catholic and the Anglican Church before the British were in charge.
How do you see the continued development of African nations, development in terms of, let's say, the Western development, and what usually comes with it is the secularization of nations. Do you see Africa in danger of heading in that direction, or do you think that the church will continue to be strong within the next century?
Question. I sort of make a distinction between two different meanings of the word secularization. I think on the one hand, secularization can mean that no single religion is enshrined as the religion of the state in question. I think that's a very valuable thing, that religious opinions can't trump non-religious opinions in matters of public life, ipso facto. I think that's a good thing. Like, that's a healthy sense of secularism that allows people to live religiously freely. And I think we still have ways to go to learn that in our country too. Now, secularization understood as the lessening of the power of religion to govern people's lives publicly and privately. Of course, I don't want that. I think that's a risk anywhere. In general, if you were looking for signs for secularization in that second sense, you could find it, especially in southern African countries perhaps, like South Africa, which has a large non-African population, as well as a lifestyle for some of that population that resembles the Western world. I don't see that kind of secularization being a likely future for most of Africa, at least for a while. I mean, people are abiding in their sense of wanting to be believers. People are, for the most part. I mean, there are exceptions, of course. There always have been, but yeah. I think it's worth holding up secularization in some ways as a very important thing for the protection of religious freedom. And I think it's unhealthy to kind of sweepingly dismiss it, because it's really valuable, protects us, and allows religion to enter the public sphere appropriately, and faith values to enter the public sphere appropriately.
Thank you for the presentation.
You're welcome.
My question concerns Africans who are outside of the continent, training to serve as missionaries. In as much as the African culture infuses their Christianity, how, in your opinion, based on your understanding of the African culture and Christianity in Africa, how can they speak about Jesus in a way that leads to a growth of the Catholic faith wherever they're sent?
When you're talking about missionaries in the Catholic world, if they're part of religious congregations, in some ways their vocation is connected to that religious congregation or religious missionary body. So, for instance, in Holy Cross, we would sort of think of the women and men who join us as also representing our congregation, and I would assume Maryknoll does the same, the Divine Word missionaries do the same, Jesuits do the same, Dominicans do the same, etc. The Vincentians here at DePaul would do the same. So in some ways, you're a missionary, not just as an African, but if you're a male member of those congregations, you're also representing the Vincentians or the Jesuits or Maryknoll or Holy Cross. And I think that determines a great deal of your way of being in the world. I've really appreciated two things about missionaries. One is the effort some of them make really heartily and really generously to empty themselves of preconceptions so they can meet people where they are, wherever they go. That kind of self-emptying is a beautiful act of missionaries, to kind of be with the people you're sent to in a humble way, right? Absent any kind of what Kollman talked about, pomposity or arrogance that ill befits Christianity. That seems to me an ideal for the missionary vocation. At the same time, missionaries ought to not be afraid to be an outside voice at the same time, wherever they go. There's a value to being a stranger, even when as a stranger you're trying to be someone who's at home. Because strangers see things into us that people who know us very well can sometimes overlook. I think missionaries have that gift to give as well. It looks like it's the opposite gift of identifying with the people you serve. In fact, I think the more you consciously and in a self-aware way seek to identify with them, the more you can consciously and in a self-aware way be a helpful stranger. And I think that's how we communicate Christ himself. I think he was a helpful stranger for the rest of us.
Just a little bit of a different take on the question of Western and missionary influence in Africa. I think that with the closing of the 19th Party Congress in China, and with work that we're seeing in China as far as the One Belt, One Road, as well as investments of China in Africa, what sort of, we've talked about this from a Western perspective and the perspective of being the outsider. Do we have any anecdotal experience based upon what may have happened in other places? But as we see China coming into a more active global role, and perhaps some withdrawal in the United States and some uncertainty in the European Union, how does that potentially impact Christianity and Catholicism in Africa?
Lots of people who study Africa from a political and economic and social perspective will say, and if you're on the ground, you will recognize Chinese presence most across the continent in various ways. The Chinese are buying large tracts of land. They set up development projects in lots of African countries and cities. They build roads. They manufacture and sell their goods. It's a mixed blessing for sure, and thoughtful Africans recognize it. On the one hand, it's an infusion of cash and technology. On the other hand, it is also sometimes the cheaper Chinese manufacturers drive down domestically produced goods. Sometimes the projects they sponsor become white elephants that can't be maintained. Sometimes the land they take is taken out of usable arable agriculture for a local economy and put into an extractive mode so that it gets exported. So it's a complex thing, and different countries in Africa deal with it differently. I think you're right that it is, as someone who cares about the continent, it's scary. Not talking about its Christianity, it's scary because it threatens to immiserate more Africans rather than enrich. It will enrich a few and immiserate more. Interestingly, the Christian story is a fascinating one, and in some ways it's just anecdotal. Africans are starting to evangelize the Chinese workers and executives that come to them. I mean, if you're a Nigerian or a Ghanaian or a Kenyan or a Zimbabwean Christian, you meet a Chinese person, they say, I don't believe in God. That's a challenge. I mean, so you have this very interesting sort of, it's happening, now it's anecdotal, right? I mean, this is complex. But I do think DePaul would be in the same boat. At the University of Notre Dame, we have about 300 Chinese students, most of them graduate students. It is remarkable how many of them decide to become Christian during their 4 or 5 years getting a doctorate. Thoughtful Chinese people understand that the Confucian values that have underwritten their culture, even through the communist period when it's at its best, erode under the assault of what is happening there now. And they go abroad and see people whose depth of character draws them. And I think they experience the same thing when they go to Africa. That's my guess. So that's a complex answer to a complex question.
Can you just speak to the relationships between the different churches in Africa and whether or not ecumenism is a conversation, what that looks like, associated to so much religious conflict?
Yeah, the ecumenism question in Africa varies from place to place and from time to time. Interestingly, some of the places that have the most intense Christian growth have the worst ecumenical history. And in some ways, the competition between Catholics and Anglicans or Catholics and Lutherans is one of the reasons there's a lot of Catholics and a lot of Anglicans and a lot of Catholics and a lot of Lutherans. So you have this odd discrepancy between, yeah, we'd like all Christians to get along, but when they don't get along, they try harder. For some weird reason. I mean, the politics of identity are complex, right? I mean, when you become something, it's really good to know what you're not. So when you become Catholic, it was really good to know you're not Anglican, in Uganda, for instance. And when you become Anglican, it's really good to know you're not Catholic. So That said, these days, my own sense is the tensions are mostly between Pentecostals, who are accused of being sheep stealers from everybody else, right? They poach Christians from everybody else, and the other kind of so-called mainline Christian denominations, Catholic and most Protestant groups. Those would be the deepest tensions, because Pentecostal energy is very appealing. And most Christian denominations have Pentecostalized segments of them, like Catholic Charismatics and the Catholic Church.
Thank you, Paul, for this wonderful presentation. My question is an ongoing reflection. I'm interested in learning your canon of history in terms of periodization about the three planting, especially within two particular contexts, from point of view of Aquinas, which this potentia obedientialis, that is, somehow God goes ahead of us, even before the missionary or before the preacher begins to preach, that there is a hunger for God, and justice, logos, spermaticos, again, which people appeal to. And Kwame Bediako has done a lot of work on this in terms of when trying to retrieve the African contribution and the identity and nature of Christianity in Africa. One must look at this autochthonous spirituality that is also rooted in a desire for God and a desire for the Lord Jesus Christ that has always been there, even beyond what the missionary, whether in the first or second or third period, had brought. So, and there are many, is a conversation I can have further with you, but I am interested in knowing then how this canon of your periodization, because you appeal to Dictionary of African Christian Biography, which is also a reversal of institutional history in African Christianity, to a concentration on actual faith process, what's happening in communities through local witnesses, and moving away from planting of churches in that specific sense of church, ecclesial structures, moving to the margins. So whether that is what you're doing, in moving away, because when we read the official church history, we see this ecclesia in Africa shows this structure. So if you are reversing it, it would be nice to know the canons for your historiography or periodization.
I don't know if I want to lift up a new canon. You could, as you say, Ecclesia in Africa, that first document after the African Synod, does reprise that three-part planting, as do just common texts. I was speaking more as an historian than as a theologian there, as you might imagine, right? Christianity understood as an historical movement, rather than as the unfolding of God's life in the world, which is how, as a theologian, I might think about it. That's a different talk, right? This is, it's framed as an historian. I think one of the canons I would start to lift up would simply be, for instance, the new insights into Roman North Africa. My colleagues at Notre Dame, Robin Jensen and Patu Burns, have just written a volume on that is, I think, very insightful. And they wrote it with the contemporary African church in mind. It's a lovely, big book about Roman North Africa, Christian North Africa, that I found helpful. The Congolese work, found the work of John Thornton, Wyatt McGaffey, John Jansen helpful. Again, these are historians. Those are historians, as is Robin Jensen and Patu Burns. So there is a canon there. It's not, again, it's not primarily theological at the level you're wanting to talk about the work of the Spirit making present God before the historical presence of Christianity, which I don't argue with. It's a different kind of a conversation.
And in talking about the history and the spread of Christianity in Africa, you kind of traced across the map, and saw some intersections with Islam along the way, and obviously the history of Islam in Africa is significant as well. And you also brought up Christian judiciary and the documentary, and I think in that film kind of illustrates some of the strong interplays between Catholicism and Islam in Africa, but also some of the challenges. So I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to that in terms of the modern Catholic Church in Africa.
Well, again, there's so much regional variation, it's hard to make generalizations. Countries where there's a considerable amount of tension between Christians and Muslims would be, for instance, Nigeria, Sudan, southern Sudan. But there's you can find small amounts of tension in lots of places. Algeria almost has no Christians, but except for this Trappist little cell that founded itself at Tiberine. But there would be other spots in northern Africa where, in fact, there isn't really Christian-Muslim tension. There's just occasionally an attack like this one. And it was complex. Algerian politics are a nightmare. I think Africa is actually a place where there's a potential for it to teach the world how Christians and Muslims can get along, because they have gotten along for much of its history. In Egypt, for instance, thoughtful Egyptians until recent times revered the Copts in their midst, whether they were Christian or not. And thoughtful Muslims protected Christians in Egypt from attacks by other Muslims when those attacks come, and still do. So it's even where Christians suffer from Islamic violence and vice versa, co-religionists of those who do the attacking protect those who are attacked, whether it's Christians or Muslims. Again, almost always the tensions are exacerbated by senses of political disempowerment and hopelessness, large masses of young people who don't know what their future is going to bring, and who are thus feeling very able to be easily mobilized to resent somebody and commit violence, in my experience. Every case I know, there's a lot more than religion going on.
Thank you for this, but you mentioned how in Africa there's this sense of deep attachment to Christ and to the Holy Spirit, and there's a lot of intimacy within that. And I think that that's something that in North America we can learn from, and I think that might be something that we're lacking in. So what would you say is what keeps that type of spirit going in Africa, and what is it that we can try to do here to mock that spirit?
My sense is a sense of religious practices with a community of fellow believers is irreplaceable in terms of keeping our faith alive. That's a very Catholic answer, but it's the one I'm going to give you. Go to church with other people you like. I think nothing can replace that. It may not be enough, right? It's necessary, but maybe not sufficient. Africans stay alive in their faith because there are other people who are alive in their faith. And so many of them, of the heroes lifted up in the Dictionary of African Christian Biography, for instance, not only courageously came to their faith, but then courageously shared it over and over again. And Pope Francis has said this very clearly, our faith gets stronger when we share it. It's like you learn something when you teach it. Hopefully parents get to be better Christians because they raise their children in the faith, for the same kind of reason.
So Paul, you mentioned this distinction between syncretism and inculturation, and I wonder if you'd say a little bit more about that in terms of what we can learn from Africa there. We have a tendency to think that inculturation is a problem for Africa and other places because Africans have culture and we don't, right? So it's always the problems about how do you adjust Christianity to African culture and so on. And we don't tend to think that's a problem in the United States. right? So what can we learn from the example of Africa about how to discern what's a good enculturation and what's not? So what in the United States context is a good adaptation to American culture and what is not so much?
In general, I like to use the word syncretism sort of anthropologically without judgment when I'm writing, because I just find it helpful. I think every time there's religious change and people's religious identities change, there's going to be something like syncretism. That is to say, a complex formation of attitudes that is going to be between stuff, that's going to be mobile, that's going to be transforming from one place to another. In the midst of that process, enculturation happens when people's faith, understood as something that's new that's come into their life, connects with something that feels abiding in themselves. And it happens individually and collectively. My own sense is top-down enculturation doesn't work very well because it's not experienced in the ways people pray, the ways people celebrate, the ways people argue, the ways people dine, the ways people do things that are infused by the life of faith they claim to want to follow. Enculturation is best understood as an organic process. You asked about the United States. My sense is certain ways Catholic parishes involve laity deeply in their lives has been a very important enculturation in the United States of the Catholic Church over the last 40 years especially. That's an interesting thing. Not just we really glad lay people are coming to church, but lay people really are the church, that's really clear. And they act as the church in this country in ways that are very inspiring. So that's something I think actually the U.S. church has to teach, or to give to a global Catholic reality. And I think, you know, Africa's a melange of cultures. It's very hard to generalize about it, but and it's hard to generalize about its Christians. But I do find people's capacity to celebrate faith pretty amazing, and I appreciated the invitation to think about how they forgive and reconcile. There's a deep, instinctive way to think about the common good that has to do with the good of communities that might mean individual sacrifice. That's deep in a lot of African senses of self. Those are real gifts to give to the church. Kind of the way people revere their past, their respect for their ancestors, is also something Africans can give to the church. I could make up, would have to think a little longer, but yeah.
Thank you.